Hi, my name is Rhonda Cronick. I live in Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, Alberta. The section of the TRC report that I'm reading is the first part of the heading, Education for Reconciliation. Much of the current state of troubled relations between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians is attributable to educational institutions and what they have taught or failed to teach over many generations. Despite that history, or perhaps more correctly, because of its potential, the Commission believes that education is also the key to reconciliation. Educating Canadians for reconciliation involves not only schools and post-secondary institutions, but also dialogue forums and public history institutions such as museums and archives. Education must remedy the gaps in historical knowledge that perpetuate ignorance and racism. But education for reconciliation must do even more. Survivors told us that Canadians must learn about the history and legacy of residential schools in ways that change both minds and hearts. At the Manitoba National event in Winnipeg, Alan Sutherland said, "There are still a lot of emotions that are unresolved. People need to tell their stories. We need the ability to move forward. But you have to understand how it all began, starting with Christopher Columbus from Christianization, then colonization, and then assimilation. If we put our minds and hearts to it, we can change the status quo." At the Commission's community hearing in Thunder Bay, Ontario in 2010, Esther Lachenette-Yabo said, "I'm doing this interview in hope that we could use this as an educational tool to educate our youth about what happened. Maybe one day the Minister of Education can work with the TRC and develop some kind of curriculum for Native studies, Indigenous learning, so that not only Aboriginal people can understand, what we had to go through, the experiences of all the Anishinaabe people that attended, but for the Canadian people as well to understand that the residential schools did happen. And through this sharing, they can understand and hear stories from survivors like me." In Lethbridge, Alberta in 2013, Charlotte Martin said, "I would like to see action taken as a result of the findings of this commission. I would like to see the history of the residential school system be part of the school curriculum across Canada. I want my grandchildren and the future generations of our society to know the whole truth behind Canada's residential school policy and how it destroyed generations of our people. It is my hope that by sharing the truth, that it will help the public gain a better understanding of the struggles we face as First Nations." Non-Aboriginal Canadians hear about the problems faced by Aboriginal communities, but they have almost no idea how these problems developed. There is little understanding of how the federal government contributed to that reality through residential schools and the policies and laws in place during their existence. Our education system, through omission or commission, has failed to teach this. It bears a large share of the responsibility for the current state of affairs. It became clear over the course of the Commission's work that most adult Canadians have been taught little or nothing about the residential schools. More typically, they were taught that the history of Canada began when the first European explorers set foot in the New World. Nation building has been the main theme of Canada's history curricula for a long time, and Aboriginal peoples, with a few notable exceptions, have been portrayed as bystanders, if not obstacles, to that enterprise. Prior to 1970, school textbooks across the country depicted Aboriginal peoples as being either savage warriors or onlookers who are irrelevant to the more important history of Canada, the story of European settlement. Beginning in the 1980s, the history of Aboriginal people was sometimes cast in a more positive light, but the poverty and social dysfunction in Aboriginal communities were emphasized without any historical context to help students understand how or why these happened. This has left most Canadians with the view that Aboriginal people were and are to blame for the situations in which they find themselves, as though there were no external causes. Aboriginal peoples have therefore been characterized as a social an economic problem that must be solved. By the 1990s, textbooks emphasized the role of Aboriginal peoples as protesters advocating for rights. Most Canadians failed to understand or appreciate the significance of these rights, given the overriding perspective of Aboriginal assimilation in Canada's education system. Although textbooks have become more exclusive of Aboriginal perspectives over the past 3 decades, the role of Aboriginal people in Canadian history during much of the 20th century remains invisible. Students learn something about Aboriginal peoples prior to contact and during the exploration, fur trade, and settlement periods. They learn about Métis resistance in the 1880s and the signing of treaties. Then, Aboriginal peoples virtually disappear until the 1960s and the 1970s, when they resurface as political and social justice activists. The defining period in between remains largely unmentioned. So much of the story of Aboriginal peoples, as seen through their own eyes, is still missing from Canadian history. In the Commission's view, all students, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, need to learn that the history of this country did not begin with the arrival of Jacques Cartier on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. They need to learn about the Indigenous nations the Europeans met, about their rich linguistic and cultural heritage, about what they felt and thought as they dealt with such historic figures as Champlain, La Vérendrye, and the representatives of the Hudson's Bay Company. Canadians need to learn why Indigenous nations negotiated the treaties and to understand that they negotiated with integrity and in good faith. They need to learn about why Aboriginal leaders and elders still fight so hard to defend those treaties, what these arguments represent to them, and why they have been ignored by European settlers or governments. They need to learn about what it means to have inherent rights, what those are for Aboriginal peoples, and what the settler government's policies, political and legal obligations are in those areas where treaties were never negotiated. They need to learn why so many of these issues are ongoing. They need to learn about the doctrine of discovery, the politically and socially accepted basis for presumptive European claims to the land and riches of this country, and to understand that the same doctrine is now being repudiated around the world, most recently by the United Nations and the World Council of Churches. Survivors have also said that knowing about these things is not enough. Our public education system also needs to influence behavior by undertaking to teach our children, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, how to speak respectfully to and about each other in the future. Reconciliation is all about respect. Magwitch for listening.